Jesus said to his disciples, "A certain rich man heard that his household manager was wasting his estate. He called the manager in and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give me a report of your administration because you can no longer serve as my manager.' The household manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is firing me as his manager? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I am removed from my management position, people will welcome me into their houses.' So one by one, the manager sent for each person who owed his master money. He said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 900 gallons of olive oil. The manager said to him, 'Take your contract, sit down quickly, and write 450 gallons. Then the manager said to another, 'How much do you owe?' He said, 1,000 bushels of wheat. He said, 'Take your contract and write 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he acted cleverly. People who belong to this world are more clever in dealing with their peers than are people who belong to the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to make friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you will be welcomed into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful with little is also faithful with much, and the one who is dishonest with little is also dishonest with much. If you haven't been faithful with worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? If you haven't been faithful with someone else's property, who will give you your own? No household servant can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be loyal to the one and have contempt for the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You see why that scholar might have said that? The hardest parable, can you pick up immediately why this is not a wildly popular parable? Not only is the parable itself completely confusing, but then it ends with that wonderful teaching we all love to hear about money. Because we love it when the pastor preaches to us about our money. And I'm not going to preach about that today, but of course it's not your money, right? It's God's money and resources gave it to you, blah, blah, blah. You've heard that before. You're going to hear it again. But anyway, that's not today's sermon. We're doing the parable. And I think one of the reasons why we get so confused when we read parables like this, and it's not just you, the folks that I read the past week, the wonderful commentaries by the people who make it their life's work to come up with the answers to these kind of things. I read 4 different commentaries, and they all said something different about this particular parable. So, who knows? But here's what I think about it, and what I think can lead our church into thinking more deeply about this and who we are in light of it. But how many of you have glasses that you wear on a regular basis? Okay, yeah. You haven't had the magic surgery, your eyes aren't fixed. What happens if you put somebody else's glasses on? It doesn't work right. How are you looking right now? How do I look to you, Brett? Yeah, fuzzy. And, okay, yeah. I mean, I can kind of see, but I'd be totally lost trying to read what I just read to you. You don't look as good as I said you did earlier in the service. You look all weird and blurry and screwed up. And this is what happens when we try to look at texts sometimes that were written in the first century to a different group of people as if they were written to folks in the 21st century right here. You can get confused. You can get thrown out of whack. And I'm getting really thrown out of whack. So, Brett, take your glasses. I'm not going to do that anymore. Take your glasses back. Here you go. Thank you. So what we need to do, if we're going to understand what this parable is talking about, is everybody take out your first century Jewish glasses. You got them? And pop those on. Thank you. We had two people in the back did it. But so, okay, good. Now you're going to look at this parable through your first century Jewish person's glasses. You ready? Okay. If you're going to be told a story, and you're a first century Jew, about a master who puts a group of people, I already tipped you off, who puts somebody in charge of taking care of his property, who are you immediately going to assume this story is talking about? You, the Jewish people, because remember God created the world, Genesis chapter 1, and Genesis chapter 1, 26 through 31, you can read it again, and creation was created, and God put the people in charge of be stewards. You take care of my stuff, take care of my property, treat it well, treat it as I would treat it. So the people are in charge, and then Abraham comes along, God creates the people of Israel through Abraham, and says to that people that you are to be a light to the nations, a light, which Jesus says right here, the people of light, or the character in the story, it's a little confusing. The people of light don't deal as cleverly as the people of darkness do, the people of this world. So you would immediately think that he's talking about you. And you would immediately realize that there was a little bit of judgment going on there. You were meant to steward the master's property, but the people had not stewarded the property well, had they? That was part of why Jesus was there, to talk about that, to pass judgment on that lack of good stewardship skills by the people. But what was the response of the folks who were leading the Jewish people to their failed lack of stewardship? You remember, what was the response to Jesus? Who was he talking to in this parable? The Pharisees. What was their response to the changing times, to the crisis that was coming upon them, to all those sorts of things? Tighten everything up. Tighten everything up. If we have failed to be a holy people, if we've failed in our calling to be who God created us to be, then the answer is to tighten everything up. More rules, more regulations, more holiness. Everybody be as holy as possible. And of course, by doing that, tighten everything up, more restrictions, more holiness, they were doing just the opposite of what Jesus came to show them was to be done, right? Every extra rule they layered on top, every extra requirement, every tightening up of the law excluded somebody else. The beginning of this line of parables, if you remember back a few weeks ago, was that Jesus was talking to the tax collectors and sinners, and then the Pharisees and the legal experts were mumbling among themselves, saying, "He eats with tax collectors and sinners." And so he's telling this parable to them. So it's a clear message, if you're a first century Jew, that the answer to all the lack of being a good steward and you haven't taken great care of the property and a crisis is coming where you're about to get kicked out because you haven't done well in your call, the answer is not to try to tighten everything up. The answer is to be clever like the dishonest manager. Because what did he do? Also, for first century Jewish glasses that are still on, the Jewish people were prohibited from lending money at interest. How wild would that be? If we put, that totally makes no sense with your 21st century glasses on. Go back today, this afternoon, read Ezekiel chapter 18. God, through the prophet, is calling the people on the carpet for their sins, and one of those is lending money at interest. So they weren't allowed to lend money at interest, but if you were a good, wonderful, dishonest business person, you were all about the almighty dollar back then, what you would do is not lend money at interest, but you'd lend different things at interest. So you'd lend in kind. So there's a good chance that what the dishonest manager is doing is simply knocking off the interest from the olive oil and the wheat that his manager had unjustly done in the first place, thus putting his manager in a position to either declare that he was messing with people or to just say what he did, "Man, you got me. You acted cleverly. You got me." And in the process, made friends with all the wrong people, because what kind of a person would say, when they're told, "Take the contract and go ahead and knock off half your debt"? "All right, yeah, I'll do that. I'll sign my name to that." Or, how much wheat do you owe? 1,000. Make it 800. "Yes, I will do that." He went to all the wrong people, all the people that Jesus was going to. All the wrong folks. But he was smart. He was using the resources he had to make friends. The Pharisees weren't using the resources they had. They were using what they had to exclude as much as they possibly could to make everything good and holy. And in the process, they left themselves homeless in the eternal sense. And so Jesus says, be like the clever manager, go out, Make friends with everybody. Use the wealth that you have to make friends. Doesn't matter if they're the right friends, the wrong friends. Make friends and find yourself in an eternal home. Does that make even a little bit of sense in the ancient sense of things? Judd said about that much. About that much. It's still confusing. It's a confusing parable. And then he layers on the money thing. Use your money, use it well, use it wisely. But what is a wise use of money in Jesus' mind? Is it make as much for yourself as possible? No, it's build the kingdom. It's give it away. You know this because that's what he kind of told people. The young rich man, what do I have to do to get into the kingdom of heaven? Do you do the commandments in that? I do. All right, cool. Sell everything you own, give it to the poor, and follow me. Or Zacchaeus. Went into Zacchaeus' house, and Zacchaeus was very wealthy, and he came out, and Zacchaeus said, I'm going to follow Jesus. And he gave half of everything he owned to the poor. So we kind of get what Jesus, like financial manager, I don't think he'd get hired with your 21st century glasses on. Jesus the Christ, financial planner, you don't want him if you're looking to make a whole bunch of money. But if you're looking to build the kingdom and find yourself an eternal home, he's just the guy you want. And that's his plan. But one of the keys to understanding what this parable is saying is to remember what came right before it. What chapter are we in Luke? It's in your bulletin. This is an easy answer today. Thank you. Good. It took just a second. Yeah, that's not a trick question. And what chapter came before chapter 16? See? You're doing well this morning. And what parable ended chapter 15? The prodigal son. The prodigal son. Jesus tells this parable immediately after that parable that's all about everybody dying. You can't be who you were. You are dead now. You can't be that anymore. Now I'm going to raise you to life, and we're going to have a huge party, and you're going to have to live as people who are reborn. And then he tells the parable of the unjust manager. The only guy in that story who was willing to die, he was faced with his own mortality, his imminent end. You will no longer be my manager. And went out and did all the craziest things. He went out and had a party with somebody else's money, granted, but he had a good time, which the prodigal son taught us is the point. He was willing to put on the goofy party hat like you all did 2 weeks ago and just cut loose. But if that's what it meant back then, how do we apply that today? Because there are people who have read this and thought, okay, Jesus is condoning my dishonest business practices. I've been waiting for this scripture for my whole life. I can go out and defraud folks. Obviously, that's not it. But what is it? If I were preaching in any number of other churches that I've been in, I would talk about how a lot of the folks that I've interacted with are very pharisaical. We act like Pharisees, that the world is changing. Is it not? Changing at a pretty rapid rate, and we're faced with new situations we haven't faced before, and it's very scary, and it's kind of a crisis situation in the culture. And the response of so many churches and individuals that I've met is to tighten everything up, to try to make ourselves as holy as possible, to treat this wonderful church as if it's a fortress against all the evils that are beating down on us. And so we get inside the church and we tighten everything up. We're going to be as holy as possible, and we'll be good and safe right here. And so if I were in any other church, I would preach about how you can make yourself as safe as possible, but unless you walk outside the church's doors, what you're building for yourself is a wonderful, beautiful tomb. And I'm sure caskets are comfortable, but I have no interest in sitting in one now. And in Jesus' economy, Jesus the Christ financial planner, you only get your life when you give it away. And so I would call and I would cheer and I would yell that you got to get outside this church's walls or you are going to die. But then this parable is about people who already have died and how they're trying to live as reborn new people. And I'm talking to you. And as I recall, you already died once. Kind of. Or got awful close. And then, like the party people and the prodigal son, like the dishonest manager, God brought you back to life. And so the call for you isn't necessarily, get outside the church's walls or you're going to die, because you already did that. You got outside the church's walls and were brought back to life by the Spirit of God. And so, what's the message for you? I want you to hear what other people are saying about you. I want you to hear it, because I don't know that there's any other place where you would. Because I just walk up to people, or people walk up to me, and they say things that I don't know if you know about yourself. But you know how if you have a sick friend, sometimes that person doesn't know that they're sick, but everybody else does? You know, like, gosh, they don't look good. Well, people are saying just the opposite about you. In June, I walked into the presbytery meeting, or presbytery office for something, I don't remember what, and a guy who was from out of town came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm so-and-so." I shook his hand. I said, "Well, I'm Josh Bauer. I'm the new pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Albany." And he said, "You're the new pastor of First Presbyterian Church? How did you get so lucky?" So I don't know. I kind of thought they were lucky. But how did you get so lucky? And then the conversation shifted. How'd you get so lucky to serve that church? And I don't know how he heard about you or what he's heard, but he thought you were pretty great. Yesterday, I taught a little class at the presbytery office, and I was talking to somebody ahead of time, and he said to me, "Man, from what I can tell, you guys have got just a sweet setup down there." And again, I don't know exactly what he meant by that, and he's local. He's not from out of town. He knows this church. He thinks you have a pretty sweet setup right here where you are. And then somebody, a friend of mine, wrote to me in an email, "You're serving a church that's experienced a rebirth. The best days are ahead for it. It's in a strategic, perfect location for small urban ministry." It's what other people are saying about you. And last week I had 2 conversations on back-to-back days with people who talked about, the like big picture people who do studies of all these sorts of things, how there used to be these thriving downtowns in places like Albany and Valdosta and other places, but they died. They were killed by the mall movement, and everybody went outside of town, including, congratulations for that. Thank you. You weren't there when it happened, but you just manage it now. And the churches did too. The churches left because it wasn't cool anymore to be in a downtown. But now there's a shift happening where there's a thirst for this downtown thing that doesn't exist out at the Logan's or the Texas Roadhouse or the Golden Corral or something. That there's a sense and a thirst for some kind of intimacy and tight-knitness that doesn't exist there. And we don't know exactly what that is, and it certainly won't be what it was in the 50s and 60s in downtown areas. It'll have to be radically different, but people actually want it now because they feel hollow in those other places. And so I feel like God is saying, look at these teachings. Look at the people in them. If you want to say, fantastic, God brought us back to life, and now we can be like every other church. We can just be good and comfortable and have fun together, just us. Like, awesome, seal the door. We'll have a ball and die. Not the good kind, but the bad kind. But you already died once, and God raised you to life, and so how are you going to live? Be crazy about it. Be innovative. Be creative. It hasn't been done this way before. I always wondered, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, it doesn't say anything about his life afterward. But what did he do? Like, what do you do when you've been dead for 4 days and then you're raised up from the dead? How do you live? And that is your story. That's what's coming down the line. That is where you fill in the blank. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that awesome? So the call, I think, with the dishonest manager is realize that you're dead already, that you already have been brought back to life. And then follow the example of all the crazies, the father and the prodigal son himself, this dishonest manager, and go out and use every resource that God has given you to make all the kind of friends you can. The right guys, the wrong guys, the right gals, the wrong gals, everybody, until we're welcomed into our eternal home. Amen.